Hello, I'm Jemison Ballard, and this is Despicable Journeys. Today, we're having special guest Renfail to talk about Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Amazon's upcoming series doesn't have rights to all of Lord of the Rings books or the Middle Earth books, and with that, they don't really acknowledge the Silmarillion and other books Tolkien has that they don't have rights to. So with that, a lot of people were really trashing on the Rings of Power's recent release of the trailer, along with IGN's video that has a Tolkien professor answering questions. And with that, we have some questions we're going to ask Rainfail, along with his opinions on the first six movies. We'll be talking to him in just a second. Here we go.
Hey,
Oh,
can you hear me all right?
yep. All right. So first off, before I say anything, your name is pronounced Renfail, right?
You can either call me Renfield or you can call me by my real name, Tim. Either one is fine by me.
All right. I'm just gonna go with Renfail. All right. So today I'm gonna be getting some of your views on the Rings of Power, along with asking a couple questions and possibly giving off a little information you may not have heard yet. But
Sure.
first, I'm gonna more ask like the six original movies. I'm gonna ask a little bit of questions about that because I'm sure people would like to know your opinions on the original six too.
Sure.
All right, so first off, I'm going to give you a moment to tell the listeners where they can find your content, your social media, and all that, because that's the most I can do.
The easiest way, all my personal stuff you can find is my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Renfail. There's a bunch of links there to all my other social stuff. Beyond that, the big projects that I like to promote are what I'm working on with my brother and my wife, which is our own fantastical world of the Weave and the Void, which is all produced through our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/Wandering Hermits. It's a 5th edition tabletop setting, along with a point and click adventure game and a book series, kind of like Dragonlance, that's all done through there. Those are the main places you can find. And there's links at all those places if you want to dig deep and go crazy.
All right, so now on to the first six movies, the more questions related to that. When were you first introduced to the movies, and did you read the books prior to seeing the movies?
Oh yeah, I grew up on the books. So I read The Hobbit when I was 5, and I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 7 for the first time, read it again when I was 9. And then by the time I hit 12, it became an annual thing where I read it annually up until that time I was probably 22, 23. So the films came out uh, when I was late teens when they were first started to getting came out, and I was in my early 20s when those came out. So I definitely loved the books prior to seeing the films.
Funniest part is, I also was introduced to the Middle Earth books at 5. That is hilarious.
I read the Lord of the Rings after, if I remember correctly, around 5 years old. My parents gave me the Narnia books, and then from Narnia I went straight to The Hobbit. And then there was, a year or two in between there of going back and reading The Hobbit and the Narnia books over and over again. And then at 7, my dad thought that I was capable of handling the Lord of the Rings, and gave me those to read. So young age getting introduced to Tolkien is I think it's a pretty cool thing. I mean, it's definitely different than I know current generation. My younger brother is an example. He went straight to like Harry Potter as his first big
Yeah.
fantasy series and didn't get into Lord of the Rings until later in life.
All right. And are the books or movies better? And what makes one or the other better?
So you can never answer that question in a way that's going to satisfy everyone, because you're going to have fans. Here's a good example. My wife has never read the books, loves the films, but has never read the books, and that's
Oh
fine.
wow.
As someone who grew up on the books, I am always going to say that the books are better, because there are things that you can do as an author that you just can't do in a film medium, no matter what medium you're dealing with, or whether it's short films, series, or long form films. You're going to have to cut fat off the bone, because you can't have pages and pages and pages of exposition. You have to be able to cut that down into a run time that's going to be feasible for production, and to not draw people into the theater and make them watch a 6-hour single movie. So the books are always going to be better, in my opinion, for any source material out there. However, the films are what they are, and I think they're amazing. Obviously, they are universally acclaimed for a reason, and I think they did a very good job, even though, yes, they did make some subtle changes here and there. But books for me are always going to be the best because you can actually dive in and get way more than you're going to get from a film experience.
All right. And do you think there was any valid issues that they should have changed in Lord of the Rings or Hobbit's movies?
Um, yeah, that's a fun one to answer. There are things that I don't like in both cases. Especially, and I think most people will agree with this. The Lord of the Rings films are good. The Hobbit films are not as good. I think most would agree with me on that. Not everyone, obviously. There was a lot more uh, addition of things. There was additional material added to um, the Hobbit films compared to the Lord of the Rings film. I will have to see people say like the Uruk-hai character, Lurtz, I believe was his name in the Lord of the Rings films. Oh, he didn't exist in the books, and Peter Jackson should have never created that character. And people apply that to the same conversations being had about Rings of Power and characters being created from scratch. But Lurtz was not a main character, right? He was not a speaking character, did not have a speaking role. He was there to serve the purpose of a bad guy. He was there, for a brief moment, a few brief moments in the first film. Whereas you go into, say, the Hobbit films, and the character of Radagast was e- expanded upon a lot, and also there were some creative liberties taken with the character of Radagast, which I personally don't agree with, but it is what it is. Like when I'm reading the books, Radagast was always more of a reserved druidic character who was respected by Gandalf for his wisdom and etc. But when we see him in the Hobbit films, he's more of a caricature that was put in there to provide some type of comic relief to Gandalf's stoic idealism, because Gandalf is always a very solemn character, and whereas then we have Radagast who's like, "Rare, I'm a hippy dippy dude," and those little things, not my favorite aspects of the Hobbit films, but it's one of those things where I always look at it and go, you know what? It's not the thing that I would have chosen, but I don't see that as taking away from the source material in any way. You're just kind of playing around with that character and giving him a little bit of flair, which can be done if it's done tastefully, if that makes
True.
sense.
True. And do you think anyone was very much miscasted in either of the movies?
No, I'm pretty happy with everybody that got cast. It was an interesting thing to obviously go back and hear the early talks about how um, Viggo Mortensen was not the first choice. They had shot with Stuart Townsend, who I love as an actor. I love Stuart Townsend. 13, I believe, was the name of. There's a comic book adaptation that he did, which is just phenomenal. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, his portrayal as Dorian Gray. I think Stuart Townsend is a great actor, but I can't see anyone other than Viggo Mortensen as an example in the role of Aragorn. And then there was, rumors of other characters who could have played Gandalf, who were asked to play Gandalf. Sean Connery being the most famous one, and I
Yeah.
just can't. I have a hard time. I just can't picture, like, the accent and everything. So no, I'm a big fan of everybody who made it into those films, cast wise. I think that, you know, from my opinion, all the main characters who were shown, they got the right people for the job, in my mind.
All right. And do you think it's right that people compare Game of Thrones to the Middle Earth movies?
Uh, how is this an adult language show? How deep
It's
can I
it's
go?
it's perfectly fine.
Okay. I think people are off their fucking rocker when they want to try to make comparisons to Game of Thrones because I feel like that's what everyone wants to say about every show. When the Wheel of Time was getting rolled out, everyone was saying, "Oh, it's gonna be this, this, and that," and we're comparing it against Game of Thrones. When the Shannara show came out a few years ago, we got to compare it to Game of Thrones. Rings of Power, we got to compare it to Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is its own thing, and it's very, I guess, frustrating to me when that is the sort of benchmark that everyone wants to use. And I think that the reason that is because it was in its time and still is to some degree like the biggest fantasy show that had ever come out and dominated, the international audience in a way that hadn't happened since the Peter Jackson films came out. But it's a series, so it's like, oh, we now have a fantasy show that has done for the fantasy genre what the fantasy films Peter Jackson did to the movie industry back in the early 2000s. So I think that's why people like to make that comparison, is just because it's the only huge fantasy show that has been successful at that level. But I don't think it's a fair comparison because we're dealing with, whether it doesn't matter if we're talking Wheel of Time, Shannara, Raymond Feist just signed for like the, I don't know, 30th time the rights to the Rift War saga, so that might happen. Any fantasy series you want to pick, if that were to get produced in today's genre, in today's era, I feel like it would be compared to Game of Thrones. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing, because everyone's always going to be expecting that sort of visceral violence and sex and sort of over the top, you know, gritty realism and low magic that Game of Thrones was, very heavily a political show, as opposed to, say, Wheel of Time, which does have its politics, but has a lot more magic. It's a high fantasy setting. And Tolkien, which, of course, has a very high fantasy magic setting as well. So they're completely different in my mind. And it's one of those things that I always just kind of shake my head at and go, no, you guys are crazy. You're fucking crazy.
I that, most of the time I remain unbiased, but I perfectly agree with that opinion. All right, so that is my last of the first six questions, and now I got Rings of Power questions. And a lot of
Sure.
people, I noticed, I've been watching your content since probably when you first started your Old Republic content. So I was happy to see your Rings of Power videos blow up.
It's a fluke, to be honest with you, because I have never done any sort of like rant style discussions before. I've always just done my channel has always been just for me and Chris, my wife, and it's mostly just book reviews and playing Star Wars: The Republic, playing Lord of the Rings online, doing some cooking stuff, and every once in a while, I've had the Mondays and MMORPG show, and I've done the Diaries of Indie Game Dev show, and then recently I started the MMORPG analysis show because people wanted to, our community in Discord wanted to have more discussion pieces. Well, then I happened to just stumble upon this the Vanity Fair piece, and I was very sort of concerned because um, my friends Simmerg and Nathan Napalm, I do the Looking for More podcast with them every Thursday, and we have been sort of getting hyped for this second age show that was coming down the pipeline for Amazon, and then the Vanity Fair piece came out, and it was like, oh, this is not what we thought it was going to be, and so it I wanted to create a piece of content around that, and that just by I think by sheer chance happened to go viral, and so since then, it has been kind of blowing up, and there's been lots of discussions happening about that over on my channel and beyond.
That is very true, and I think the main part of that is the fact that Amazon blames it on white supremacists, saying, "Oh, it's because we have indigenous people acting in our movie," and meanwhile, Amazon gets away with the issues that people don't like, and they a lot of people, including me, were looking for a voice, looking for someone who shared our opinions, and you just happen to be the one.
Well, I think I definitely share some of the irritation that a lot of people have, but as an example, one of the things I'm definitely not on board with, and this is I actually just put out a video right before I came into this show, questioning, does race matter in Middle Earth? Because one of the things I really appreciated about Peter Jackson was the fact that he kept politics out of the conversation. It was very much, this is a story we're going to tell. It's not about color of skin. It's not about indigenous representation or anything like that. We're just going to keep it focused on, we have the Ring of Power, we have the hobbits, and we have the races of Middle Earth, which are not humans, and they're being impacted by the threat of Sauron coming back. And that story is all about getting the ring back to Mordor and destroying the ring and dealing with the threat of war and everything else that's going on, as opposed to it being about you know, I'm going to say a word here that some people might not like, but I consider it to be a little silly to focus on, you know, it's like I don't need to talk about Trump's presidency as an example or Biden's presidency in relation to or how it might apply to Tolkien's world because it's not Tolkien's world. Middle Earth is a thing separate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but I am definitely concerned about I think my biggest concerns lie around the fact that for better or for worse, whether it's because the Tolkien estate won't sell the Silmarillion rights or Amazon couldn't put a big enough chunk of money on the table, um, we're dealing with a very small amount of material in the appendices, which are being used to create a supposed 5 season arc. And that concerns me, especially when we've heard that they're going to be condensing several thousand years of history into one very compact time frame, which was Wheel of Time suffered from that as well because they took I think basically the first 3 or 4 books and tried to make it into I forget how many episodes were in that first season, 7 or 8, um, and it felt very very rushed.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that them filming in the UK instead of filming in New Zealand like they said they first would will affect the quality of the show?
Um, I don't think so. There was some valid concerns I think about people who wanted it to be remain in New Zealand because of that's where the Peter Jackson films were filmed and that's where the Hobbit films were filmed and there's a landscape to New Zealand that when we're talking about the wide shots and actual landscapes, um, you're gonna get that New Zealand realism. But as we've seen from the trailer they've shown us, or at least from what I've gathered from the trailer, we're not getting much real world scenery. We're getting lots of CGI. So the decision to move to the UK, from what I understand, was purely tax incentive related and budgeting, because they can make it for a hell of a lot cheaper in the UK than they can in New Zealand. It's closer to home. It's not as far away. There's tax incentives at play, and because they're relying so much on CGI and sets, they're not actually filming as much in real environments as they did with, say, the Peter Jackson films.
Yep. Yep. And do you think the fact they're using CGI and green screen sets will affect the show in any way?
It definitely affects my perception of it. And I mentioned I did an overview video on the trailer because I saw the CGI and I just went, ugh, it's a little too much over the top. There's some great if you ever go back and watch like the old documentaries on Star Wars, working with A New Hope, they had no CGI basically, and then getting into Empire Strikes Back, they were starting to use blue screen, and by the time they got to Return of the Jedi, they had started to incorporate more and more. But even up until the prequel trilogy, Lucas always had a foundation in creating sets, miniature sets, and only using CGI as it was needed to have, certain key moments or to enhance those. And Frank Oz actually has a really good interview where he talks about um, from a puppet's perspective that when you're trying to make a CGI film or a film that has a lot of CGI in it, you're always going to have the best results when you have sets and real pieces, and then you're making your CGI match that, so it's going to look as real as possible. Because it doesn't matter if it's a miniature or a real set; they look real because they are physical. And so there's a physicality to that the camera picks up. And so if you're matching that with CGI, it looks better than trying to build something completely in CGI. Because when something is completely built in CGI, you lose that realism and the camera doesn't have a chance to pick up on it because it's just not there. And so like the scene from the trailer that really stood out to me, there's a wide shot, it's a very quick shot of what looks to be an elvish meeting happening in a forest, and it looks like something directly out of a video game. It like out of God of War or something. It doesn't look like anything that has any physical components to it, which is one of the reasons I think Peter Jackson's films looked so well and have held up so well over the years because they were based in, miniatures and bigatures and creating physical components that were then enhanced with CGI. And then if you go watch the Hobbit films, I think rightfully so criticize the Hobbit films because most of their sets were done like the big sets were all done in CGI, and it looks like CGI comparatively speaking.
True, true. So Amazon said they're making the story Tolkien never wrote, and they don't have rights to Tolkien's other works like the Silmarillion in this case. Do you think it's true that they don't that they didn't just the Tolkien estate won't sell it, or do you think they're making an excuse to write their own story?
I think if I had to guess, given how Christopher Tolkien never sold the rights during his entire life, I would say it's probably in his will that the Silmarillion never gets sold to be made as a television or film feature. Um, if I had to guess, just because those works have never, ever, not since J.R.R. Tolkien died and throughout the entirety of Christopher Tolkien's lifespan, those rights were never given up. The only rights anyone has ever had to work with were the rights that were sold in 1976, and those were the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings films rights and game rights and stuff, which the Saul Zaentz company has held since then and just recently decided to sell. I think for me, it's very telling that in all those years that the Silmarillion could have been sold, it never was, because Amazon certainly has the cash, and the fact that they paid 250 million for the rights to do what they're doing suggests to me that they probably would have been happy to pay 500 million, to get an IP that they could exploit for billions of dollars. So I think this is my opinion, no facts behind this. I think it was a case of the estate not being willing to sell the Silmarillion works to be exploited in that manner.
All right. And do you think it's ridiculous that Amazon didn't add beards on the female dwarves, claiming it was anti-feminist and they didn't look ladylike enough, even if it is a work of fiction?
Um, yeah, I just did a video about this
I saw that.
yesterday. Yeah, so I'm of the opinion that the dwarven women need beards. I just think they do because we even have it in Peter Jackson's films. There's several throwbacks to dwarven women having beards. Aragorn does that whole thing where I believe it's when he's talking to Eowyn and he's like, "It's the beards," and then
Yeah.
there's another section when Gimli's talking to Eowyn about dwarven women and the mythology and the whole springing from stone mythology, because no one's ever seen them, but they look just like men. And then also he talks about when he's drunk, swimming with naked, hairy little women or whatever it is. And so they're definitely the Peter Jackson films referred back to that those descriptions, not only in the appendices, but also in the extended works. And there has been some argument recently from people who say, well, the most recent book that came out, like last year or whatever it was, it's a very recent book. That book specifically says that dwarven women, only dwarven men have beards. And I'm like, okay, now you're dealing with semantics, because now you're trying to say this most recent book, which is the most recent out of 30 books that have ever been published on Tolkien, is the one that says that. It's like I go back to the source material, and in the appendices, it specifically states that you can't tell a dwarf woman apart from a male dwarf. And then there's people who will argue that, well, Tolkien never specifically said dwarves had beards, and it's like, okay, now we're getting into semantics again. I personally think that they had beards, so it's one of those things that just for me, if you look at the Silmarillion and History of Middle Earth and all that stuff, we very clearly have the Nogrim and other, all the dwarves being talked about as having beards and the women looking exactly like the men. So I think that they should, and it doesn't have to be a full beard, but at the same time, the appendices do state that you can't tell the men from the women. And we were having this discussion the other day in YouTube. I was like, you know what? Somebody had said, "What if we had transgender people in the role with beards?" And I was like, I'm personally, I'll raise my hand and say I have a beard. I'd have to wear a wig, but I was like, I'd be happy to play a dwarven princess. I would have no problems.
How do you feel that Amazon, especially in IGN's video, is a good example with that Tolkien professor? How do you feel that they don't really acknowledge that they don't have the Silmarillion or any of the other works and act like only Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the appendices exist?
Well, yeah, it's unfortunate. They have made comments in the Vanity Fair pieces that very specifically we have the rights to this, and we're going to paint within these lines. From a legal perspective, they can't. touch anything else. So from a legal perspective, it's very smart not to even talk about it, because if they talk about it, then they're drawing comparisons, and that could lead to legal issues down the road. So I get it. I don't agree with it. Um, I also think that you're trying to spend way too much out of a small section of the Lord of the Rings. But they've made some very interesting comments about, we have everything we need. I'm quoting off the top of my head, so don't quote
Yeah,
me on this. I'm remembering. It's something along the lines of, we have everything we need to know about the Second Age within the books that we have the rights to, and as long as we paint within those lines, we'll be fine.
yeah,
Well, I mean, there is some stuff in there, but that was my issue with the creation of all these new characters, is because you already have all the characters there. They're just in the material that you don't have the rights to. So what they're going to be doing at this point is making facsimiles, basically, of those characters with new names, um, or at least that's the representation that I get from creating this new elf character who has a relationship with a human female. Like, that's the Baron and Luthien tale, which they can't talk about because they don't have the rights to that. Um, so I mean, it's unfortunate. It goes beyond just the IGN article, but yeah, it's one of those things that's difficult because they don't have a lot to work with. Um, I think if they would have, trying to pull 5 seasons out of the appendices is going to be tricky, because there's so much more that was going on during the Second Age, and that's the other thing that I keep coming back to, is they keep wanting to make these comments about how we're going to write the novel that Tolkien never did. And I understand some people have made the argument that, well, what they're referring to is there was never a narrative novel written like The Lord of the Rings about the Second Age, because the Silmarillion and the other stuff it's like a Bible, it's tales put together, but it's not one single narrative telling a story. So if you want to deal with the technical aspects of the English language and twist things around, which is how I feel like that's what they're doing with this whole the dwarven beards thing, by saying Tolkien never specifically said that dwarven women have beards because the appendices doesn't have the word beard in it. Trying to use technicalities to provide reasoning for why you're making the creative decisions, I think, is a bit of a stretch for me personally. That's one of the reasons why I'm a little concerned, more than a little, I'm a lot concerned about the story of the Rings of Power more than any other issue. It's the story for me.
So, how do you feel that Amazon is rumored to be having a gender confused character who is said to be Isildur's sister, even though that would contradict the lore of the movies, books, and I believe the appendices too?
Right. This just goes back to Peter Jackson's quote, and I should pull it up if I can real quick. I'm gonna make sure that I pull this quote so that I don't misquote him. We made a promise to ourselves at the beginning of the filming process that we weren't going to put any of our own politics, our own messages, or our own themes into these movies. And the video I just did today, which talks about, does race matter in Middle Earth? This is an issue of where I think people are putting their own political, I don't want to use the word agenda because that makes it seem like it's some nefarious thing, but definitely people are definitely using their own political views and worldviews to influence what they want to put into the show. And that's one of the things that I appreciate from Peter Jackson's work, is that even though, I mean, great example of this is, we have the dwarf and elf romance that was put into the Hobbit film, which never happened in the books, right?
Yep.
We were given this relationship, this female character that did not exist in the books, and there was a lot of people who were upset about that. Um, I was not that upset with it because of one reason. It wasn't a political statement. It was a relationship statement. It was not a, hey, we have to make a gender confused, or we have to put a transgender, or we have to, it wasn't something done for the purposes of adding a political statement to it. It was just done because, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we showed that elves and dwarves could maybe have relationships? Like, maybe they could get together and have that, you know, male, female, whatever it might be, relationship. But there wasn't anything political about it. It was just a relationship thing thrown in there for romantic interest in a film. Because outside of that, there's no other romances happening in the Hobbit films, right? It's a very straightforward tale about the hobbits go to the mountain, steal some gold, piss off the dragon, and then have to defeat the dragon. Not the hobbits, the dwarves, sorry.
Yeah.
So if that's true, and if they are doing that, I feel like that's another example of, people putting their own political views, worldviews into it, which in my mind doesn't serve the story at all. But that's just my personal opinion. I think it's great to want to include everyone and make sure that everyone feels like they're represented in a show. But I'm not a big fan of adapting source material and trying to force viewpoints into it. And it doesn't have anything to do with me agreeing or disagreeing with those viewpoints. It's just one of those things where I don't think you should do that to any sort of source material. It would be like um, taking Shakespeare and you know completely rewriting it and saying, well, Shakespeare was wrong when he wrote this, so we have to make it more modern. No, Shakespeare is a classical piece of art. You don't go take the Mona Lisa off the wall and paint over it because you want to fix the things that you view as wrong with it. You know what I mean? It's a piece of
Yep.
art. It stands on its own. It's classic. It doesn't need to be fixed. You look at it with its flaws, whether they're perceived or otherwise. You enjoy that piece of art for the piece of art it is without needing to redo it.
All right. And if at all, do you think there may be any good ideas or quality to the show that might save it?
Um, I'm still of the opinion like I will watch it because my wife has not read the books and so she's going to want to watch it from the perspective of a generic fantasy show. I still have my fingers crossed that at the very least the entertainment factor that I'll be able to get out of it is I'll be able to see things that have never been represented in a visual format before. Things like Khazad-dûm in its prime, Numenor in its prime, um, hopefully getting to see the fall of Numenor in a really cool CGI sequence, would be, awesome to see, the island going down under the sea. So there are definitely things that I'm looking forward to from a visual perspective. I'd love to see, going back and seeing the trees and Valinor and all this other stuff. There's stuff that I really hope we get to see in the show. Story wise, though, I'm so concerned over the changes that are being made from what appears to be the political or worldview, whatever you want to call it, of needing to. We've seen the producers make multiple statements to the effect of, well, we we feel that we can see Tolkien represented in our world, and so we're gonna make that happen. So it's kind of like forcing Tolkien's works to fit into the current era, um, with current worldviews and things that didn't necessarily exist, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago. That's when storytelling becomes a little bit tricky. So, yeah, from a visual perspective, there's things I'm looking forward to. But story wise, again, we haven't actually seen any sort of full story trailer that tells us what's going on. But the teaser trailer has left me wanting, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I don't have a lot of information on this, but what do you think of the Tolkien Society and what they're doing to Tolkien's books and works?
Wow. The easiest way I can say this, they have done a lot of good work over the years for the preservation of certain components. But I will also point out, I think it was last year when there was the uproar on Tolkien's birthday. This wasn't that long ago. And I don't have everything open in front of me, so forgive me if I'm forgetting some of the minute details. But as I recall, it was Tolkien's birthday. Somebody shared a picture of Tolkien on Twitter or somewhere and said "Happy Birthday, Tolkien," etc. And then the Tolkien Society's Twitter account said, "Hey, you don't own the rights to that image. We do. We paid, $18,000 or whatever for all these images. You need to take that down because you're infringing on our copyright." and and everybody, the internet responded back like, "What are you smoking? Like, Tolkien's images are all over the internet. We have thousands of images of Tolkien to choose from. And all we did was we posted a happy birthday message using this image. And you're up in arms that you paid $18,000 for a bunch of photos that already exist on the internet." So you can't claim copyright infringement when this stuff was out there in the world for fair use in the first place. That's one of the criticisms I've seen against the Tolkien Society. Again, from what I understand, they have done a lot of good things in the preservation in past years. My understanding is that in recent years, there has been a lot of controversy over things like the copyright issue of them trying to, lay claim to things that are not theirs to lay claim to, if that makes sense. And also, I know there's been some criticism um, regarding if certain things don't fit within their interpretation of the narrative, they consider it to be um, incorrect. And I don't think that's necessarily fair because we have billions of people on the planet, and there are millions of people who have opinions on Tolkien. And I don't believe that anyone's opinion is right or wrong. Everybody has a different opinion. And the same could be said for me talking about, my views on the story and what they're doing with the story and how I don't think race plays into it. I know there's a lot of people who disagree with me, and that's fair. That's fine. Um, so that's, I don't have any more information beyond that. I'm not intimately familiar with the Tolkien Society to make any more judgments beyond that. But I know the copyright thing from last year had me just giggling because to me it looked like a scenario where people didn't really understand copyright law and were trying to lay claim to a bunch of. I mean, it would be one thing if those images weren't in the world, but those images have already existed on the internet for decades. You know what I mean? So trying to suddenly say that, well, we own the copyright to that, you can't use it. It's like, well, you know, it's one of 1,000 images I found on Google. You know what I mean? It's
Yep.
different than if I took a picture right now of, you know, a miniature that I'm working on. That's my picture because I took that picture. But the moment that I put it out on, the internet, if it's freely available, like on a wiki or something, then I've now lost the right to say that that's a picture that I can hold a copyright to. That's an oversimplification, by the way. Copyright is a complex issue, especially when we get into international copyright. But yeah, that's my take on things.
True. All right, so this is the last question, and this is more for fun for my audience and everything. If you were contracted by Amazon to make possibly a made up story in Middle Earth, what would be your basis or idea?
Oh man, that's almost too complex to think. I mean, off the top of my head, I would probably focus on, say, going into someone from, a member of the Dunedain and dealing with the complexities of their lives protecting the realm. This would be during the Third Age, so before the destruction of the ring. One of the things I always loved about Aragorn's story was spending, 50 or so years, whatever it was, running around protecting these people who didn't know that they were being protected. And I think there's a story that could be told within that framework of who the Dunedain were and their creed basically of keeping the world safe from evil. And I think you could do a lot with that story without needing to compromise or even touch the greater arcs of the Third Age that deal with the ring, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
I say that because I play Lord of the Rings online a lot, and it's a great MMORPG, and they do a very good job of weaving stories around the journey of the ring to Mordor. And so that's the first thing that jumps out to my mind is a story about somebody from the Dunedain and dealing with the complexities of protecting people that don't know that they're being protected. I mean, looking at Barlin Butterbur as this innocent, chubby little man who has no idea of the evils that lie beyond Bree. And and when his inn gets attacked by the Nazgul, it's like this moment of almost like, did that really just happen? Like, no, that should it just and a week later he's probably just like, oh, it's just a bad dream. It's that sort of scenario where he can't fathom the evil that exists in the world or the people that are there to protect him from it. That would be potentially kind of fun to talk about. Yeah.
That's certainly interesting. All right, so I don't have any more questions or anything. If there's anything you want to add, this now is the time.
No, I think we're good. I don't really have anything to add beyond that. No. I guess my only question would be, when do you air these?
I'm probably gonna try and release them probably Thursday, hopefully.
Okay, just ping me with
But
a link whenever it's up.
absolutely. All right.
All right,
Thank you
man.
so much for
Appreciate-
joining me, and you have a good
Oh, no worries,
afternoon.
man. Cheers, you too.